Hi, I'm John, and recently I wrote this fucking thing. And for ages, people have been asking me what all of this is about, to which I often respond, So today, by way of giving some level of explanation about what it's all about, I'm going to do a short wee video, an adaptation of a conference paper I gave to the British Sociological Society a wee while back, which describes one part of one chapter of fucking this beast, this thing. So, you know, this isn't like a total explainer of what's all in that thing, but it's just one wee segment. So we're gonna talk about the ways in which social movements in the UK use human rights. And to do this, we're gonna look at all the facts and fucking data that I gathered.
These are facts, and facts don't care about your feelings.
And by that I mean that the conclusions that are drawn in this paper, this thesis, are drawn from a series of in-depth qualitative interviews that I conducted with a series of activists from radical social movements and labour unions. So a really common refrain from much of the radical and left-wing critiques of human rights is that they are a necessarily bourgeois and liberal framework, which obscures the true sources of injustice and pushes activists and social movements for that matter into an individualistic, legalistic mode of being. And I mean, this is such a strong feeling, such like a powerful received wisdom on the left, that I had some weirdos getting mad about my PhD after simply seeing the title and seeing the word human rights there, and assuming because of that what its content was saying, assuming that I was making particular arguments about institutionalizing certain things, and assuming that without knowing any of the content is bad. It's not a way to approach a topic. Don't do that. In fact, I think many of the especially public-facing left-wing attempts to engage with human rights are inadequate at best. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that critical view of human rights, that they're legalistic, that they're bourgeois, is necessarily untrue. I think it's certainly true that the international legal NGO order, Amnesty International, the UN, pursuing change through legal means absolutely funnels discontent into liberal frames, especially as groups might want to pursue legally enshrining their demands. It's also, I think, especially salient to critique human rights as vehicles for imperial and colonial domination. But what is untrue, as my work shows, is that such perspectives are necessarily everything that human rights is, every permutation, every use of human rights. And they ignore the particular position that human rights plays in particular forms of social movement activism. So, for example, authors like Paul O'Connell have critiqued these sort of inadequate perspectives on human rights, that, that the liberal inclination of them is all that they are. He's critiqued this perspective, showing with reference to housing movements and with the Right to Water campaign in Ireland, that when particular forms of radical social movements make appeals to human rights, they don't necessarily displace any radical or anti-capitalist critiques. That is, he disputes the famous Displacement Thesis, which claims that human rights always displace radical perspectives. He argues that the Right to Water campaign and housing rights movements have used human rights to forward radical critiques. The exact opposite of the Displacement Thesis. And then there's other perspectives, people like Jessica White, whose book, The Morals of the Market, it's a very good book. She argued that while there are alternative constructions of human rights, like while they do exist, their dominant hegemonic construction as part of the international legal and NGO order not only plays a strong determining role in constructing the form of alternative human rights frames, but is an expression of continued neoliberal hegemony. This is in opposition to what she calls the endlessly polyvalent social constructionist view of human rights, which she argues risks viewing all possible alternative constructions of human rights as, equally powerful, equally valid, equally used. And so the perspective that I propose in my research, which is grounded in interview data and developed theoretically, builds on O'Connell's work of challenging that displacement thesis, and accepts Jessica White's perspective that the international NGO legal human rights order is certainly an essential part of neoliberal hegemony. But instead of arguing that alternative uses of human rights are endlessly polyvalent, I track the potential of counter-hegemonic alternative social constructions that can maybe play a role in disrupting not just the hegemonic form of legal institutional human rights, but disrupting neoliberal hegemony itself. And you are right. You're absolutely right. I can hear what you're all thinking. You are about to hear the word hegemony about 400 more times. So strap in. So before we go any further, I thought it'd be a good idea to share what are the basic findings at work in this sort of presentation and in this wee bit of the PhD. And because it's a blistering hot day, I thought I'd share it outside. So keep in mind throughout this that there are basically 3 findings at work here, and how these social movements used human rights and how they interacted with human rights. The first finding, consistent throughout all, was a rejection of the law, rejection of the hegemonic form of human rights. This included rejecting of Amnesty International and other NGOs, as well as rejection of national domestic level laws that dealt with human rights. The law, nobody wanted to hear about it. Nobody wanted it. It wasn't a thing anybody wanted. And if they did interact with the law, they did so very, 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 very carefully. So, fuck the law, basically. The second finding was very practical. A lot of social movement activists used it for, used human rights for movement building. I just saw someone look at me from the building opposite, so I'm embarrassed now. I'm all bashful. But they basically used it as a practical method of movement building, introducing new people to the social movement and building much wider ranging critiques on top of the basically hook of human rights. And the third and probably most important, probably the biggest contribution I make in the thesis, is that the way in which human rights is used seems to be very specifically to contest the commodification of certain areas of social reproduction, to contest the commodification of housing, of education, of hear that building work there, and cars. So you never film it. Never film outside. Never film outside. To contest the commodification of childcare, housing, prisons even. All these areas of commodification are challenged by human rights, and they seem to be the area in which human rights is most readily used by activists. So bear in mind these 3 findings throughout the rest of this presentation, and you'll be in good stead. So let us begin with a whirlwind introduction to this hegemony, and, Gramsci as well. So hegemony, to put it simply, posits an understanding of the social world whereby the power of the ruling classes is maintained via both coercion and consent. That is, hegemony is an historically specific organisation of consent that rests upon but cannot be reduced to a practical material base. Formal freedoms and electoral rights exist alongside the class inequalities of the bourgeois state. Therefore, relations of domination need to be sustained with the consent of the dominated. This consent does not arise spontaneously, it must be won through ideological struggles and material concessions. So we can understand the current period of neoliberalism as an historically specific period of capitalist hegemony, whereby the accumulation regime, the economic base, is maintained through policing and disciplinary labour and market forces, as well as welfare reforms and a whole host of other sort of disciplinary measures, whereas consent is generated through, in the global north at least, material concessions of relatively cheap commodities on the one hand, and the projection of a moral individualism and, entrepreneurialism and personal responsibility on the other. And for Jessica White, the dominant human rights framework projects the morals of the market, this individualistic, entrepreneurial, bourgeois moral framework, as a means of generating that essential consent of neoliberal hegemony, via a moral and legal order. And White's view has a lot of consistency within the neoliberal, the literature on neoliberalism. And, I agree with it as well to a strong extent. Authors like Amabel and Wendy Brown have put forward perspectives of neoliberalism as like a moral project, but White adds to this. It's not just a moral project for White, but the morals of the market are a sort of subordinate supporting structure of the material framework of neoliberalism, the supporting structure to maintain the economic accumulation regime, the labour relations of society. And this is consistent with Gramscian hegemony, in which moral ideological structures support the hegemony, yet remain subordinate to those material social relations of capitalist society. So for critics of human rights, the push to individualism, institutionalization, and the obscuring of sources of injustice is really indicative of their human rights position as part of neoliberal hegemony. Therefore, they argue that social movements should absolutely, radical social movements should absolutely distance themselves from such forms of language and such organising frames, or else they risk being part of the supporting structure of neoliberal hegemony and have no chance of overturning that. But I wanted to ask, is it even true that human rights necessarily produce the tendencies claimed by such critics? And that's when all my facts and fucking data comes in. We're fucking Ben Shapiro hour, facts and dataing this this shit. So I was a bit worried that this explanation was getting a bit too abstract, too distant to follow. So I thought I'd bring in some whiteboard action to help us all figure it out. So basically, what I'm saying here is that hegemony, as neoliberal hegemony as it exists, is held up by two things. These two things being coercion, which are dominated on the one hand by market forces, economic powers. Some people don't deny that that's coercion, but I think that's pretty coercive. Then you've got things like welfare, disciplinary welfare systems, and policing, and included in that is things like border regimes. And those things also help reshape the, there's a dog going, reshape the social relations which maintain neoliberal capitalism as well. Like border regimes are forms of racialization. Then on the other hand, we've got the consent generating sort of side of things. That includes things like ideology, your sort of standard neoliberal ideas of individualism, atomization, entrepreneurialism, and then things like the human rights, institutional human rights order, the morals of the market, as Jessica White argues. And flipping this over, we're double-siding this fucking whiteboard today. We've got things, we've got this hegemonic human rights here, just zooming right in on the hegemonic form of human rights. And it's hegemonic because it not only dominates other forms of human rights, so the institutional and legal regimes are undoubtedly the forms which dominate others. They're the things that most people think of immediately. But it's hegemonic also because it supports the hegemon, it supports neoliberalism. So White's perspective, and the perspective of quite a lot of people, is that the way hegemonic human rights works in reaction to other forms of human rights is strongly determinate, in that the hegemonic form here, I'll point with my nose, determines the alternative forms. There. And these alternative forms are largely, they're largely constructions, somewhat derivative, but always dominated by that hegemonic form. But my perspective, my alternative perspective, is that while the hegemonic form is surely dominant because, you know, it's part of the hegemon, it's hegemonic, there is an alternative form which isn't just determined by it, as in it's not just dominated by it. It exists relationally to it. It is counter-hegemonic in that it takes forms from relational forms from the hegemonic and inverts them, uses them to try and upset that hegemony. And if the counter-hegemonic form of human rights upends the hegemonic one, then that is part of this this whole side of consent generating upended. Like it wouldn't bring down neoliberalism entirely, and such thing probably wouldn't even be possible without some forms of revolutionary action, at least. But it would certainly weaken it. It would certainly add some kicks to the stabilizers of neoliberalism, which is essentially my argument here. I hope that clarifies things. I might return to these little diagrams throughout. So, as part of this PhD, one thing in PhDs, an early thing that my supervisor told me was two types of PhDs that are in trouble are ones that are in controversial topics, because people don't want to, you know, you could get someone you're doing something on like Palestinian liberation, you get someone who's a massive Zionist, you're going to have trouble. But the other form of PhD that frequently gets in trouble is purely theoretical works. So it was always part of this plan to do some empirical data gathering to make sure that nobody can just go, I don't like your theory, you've got no evidence, fuck you. And so, as part of this project, which, you know, much to my mother's relief is now over, look at her there. So happy to be feeding a lamb, almost as happy as she will be once I pass my Viva and she can stop worrying. Actually, I don't think anything will be happier than she is feeding that lamb at that moment. Part of this PhD, in this data gathering, I interviewed several activists from a number of different social movements, from housing to education to GRT liberation to disabled liberation, about their use of human rights. And some really clear themes and surprisingly consistent themes emerged. I was genuinely surprised by how consistent the themes were. I wasn't expecting it. So firstly, consistent across several of these interviews was a clear skepticism of the hegemonic legal and institutional order of human rights. One participant who worked to challenge the privatisation and commodification of education, weird sentence, they stated that, in my experience, I want to sort of move away from a sort of liberal, technocratic, Amnesty International vision of human rights to actually seeing human rights as part of a wider project to build class power. And variations on this perspective are present throughout the interviews, with others literally saying they don't give a shit about human rights laws, which, you know, seems pretty definitive to me. I know this is a person who used human rights in their organising. They specifically referenced it a lot, but they didn't care about laws, and they in fact thought it was insulting, the idea that we had to beg for laws to recognise something called human rights, which is quite interesting, I think. This sort of I don't give a shit about human rights laws and these perspectives on Amnesty International and the legalism, these all sort of express the view of an inherent limitation of legalism as a means of producing change. And what they really highlight is that the activists I spoke to were more than aware of the limitations imposed by attempting to pursue change via hegemonic institutions of the law, or via human rights NGOs, or like the hegemonic form of human rights itself. And from, you know, personal experience within various activist spaces myself, I can also sort of report that this is sort of widespread perspective. I've come across it quite a lot in many spaces. And so while I think there's a tendency of like haughty academics to view our insights into the sort of hidden abode of the social world as sort of a privileged over activists on the ground, In my experience, it's those engaged in the praxis of changing the world who often have the most intimate knowledge of the world they seek to change. And, this topic is of no exception. The participants in my study, in opposition to perspectives offered by lots of people who knee-jerk respond to human rights negatively, and think that activists are going to get tricked into being sort of bourgeois subjects. The participants here were very well aware of the trappings of human rights law and institutions, and therefore engaged with it extremely carefully, if at all. There's no necessary push into an individualizing legal mode, as these sort of critics of human rights might argue. And you can see this tendency from activists if we, look to that quote from earlier about wanting to move away from a liberal and technocratic Amnesty International vision of human rights to actually seeing human rights as a project to build class power. But we can also see how, rather than an individualizing force, the human rights frame is here being wielded with the specific aim to build a collective project, build class power. It's not just, bourgeois legalism, it's about building class power. And in fact, a second theme which emerged really clearly throughout the data was that human rights frames were utilized by several activists very practically, very pragmatically, as a means and method of movement building to introduce their work to the public, whether that was on a street stall or via social media. And it's interesting to note that the very accessibility of the language of human rights, the reason that it was useful for these groups in trying to build their social movements as a tool, probably, reflects the transmission of the human rights language as part of the hegemonic order, which is an essential point, because it's really consistent with Gramscian understandings. It's a very Gramscian thing. It's a very Marxist thing to point out that certain aspects of hegemony may end up actually disrupting the basis of that hegemony as they become sort of imbued and used and utilized by members of the working class. It is counter-hegemonic in that it takes forms from relational forms from the hegemonic and inverts them, uses them to try and upset that hegemony. So this use of human rights as a pragmatic introduction was consistently conceptualized by activists as a base upon which a larger critique of neoliberal capitalism, sometimes capitalism as such, sometimes colonialism, a whole bunch of other things, it was used as a base upon which further critiques can be made. And this was, again, another extremely and weirdly consistent theme between a bunch of people who didn't know each other, whose movements didn't necessarily intersect in obvious ways, but they all sort of use these methods of engaging with human rights, which is, I think, is really interesting. And it's in opposition to the view that human rights necessarily obscure these true sources of oppression. Naomi Klein talks a lot in the Shock Doctrine about how the human rights movement in Chile obscured the fundamental economic rearrangement that was going on. And that may be true for the example of Chile, but in these cases, it reveals that it's not necessarily true. And the actual opposite is true. Human rights is being used to expose the fundamental neoliberal order which is being challenged. Participants consistently reported, for example, that when they say there's no right to education or housing, people will start asking questions about why isn't there? What does it mean if there's not a human right to education? What does it mean if you don't have access to housing or education? They start asking questions about the economic model which turns education or housing or whatever into a commodity rather than a basic means of life. They begin Contesting Commodification by Dr. JohntheDuncan, TBA. I'm not doctor yet. Soon, once I get my Viva done. Fuck, I hope that didn't break it. But this sort of view of revealing the commodification at work, which inhibits rights enjoyment, whatever, is connected to the final and, I think, probably most important theme which appeared... Oh, excuse me, I just did a burp. Oh man, maybe I am talking shit if I'm just burping up all over the place. The final theme which appeared throughout my research, and that is that human rights appear to be deployed far more readily as a means of contesting the commodification of areas of social reproduction, that is, areas which reproduce the life and labour power of an individual, of a worker, of anyone under capitalism on the one hand, and which reproduces the wider social relations of capitalism, as such, on the other. So housing or education, for example, are required for the reproduction of capitalist workers. You can't you can't work properly if you don't have a house. You need to be educated and trained in specific ways to enter the labour market to be exploited. Such things like that. Hello, Edit John back, just to clarify some stuff. So, for social reproduction, we need those goods. But the ways in which those social reproductive goods and that social reproductive work is done alters the particular labour relations, the particular social relations of society. So whether or not that's state provided, community provided, or as we're just about to see, market provided. There we go. And in these sort of areas of social reproduction, there's been a trend of commodification throughout the neoliberal age. Like authors like Tithi Bhattacharya and her book Social Reproduction Theory, which everyone here knows, or anyone who's vaguely familiar with my channel knows I harp on about all the time. Tithi Bhattacharya has done lots of good work in showing this commodification of social reproduction under neoliberalism. And I view this trend as probably the one of the two most essential elements of neoliberal hegemony, as it not only opens new areas of market expansion, but it reproduces the disaggregated classed social relations across gendered, racial and abled lines, and these are required to maintain the wider neoliberal accumulation regime. And don't worry if that sounds dense. That's absolutely dense, and it's hard to follow without like a whole ream of like fucking 100,000 other words. But if you want to learn more and want to get more context about this idea of disaggregated subjectivities through neoliberalism, my video on making a neoliberal subject goes into greater detail on this while I cook a nice vat of tasty slop. Slop. Which is what I say anytime a new Star Wars show comes out. Slop. Man, that fucking Ashoka's show is really bad. It's really bad. That is some slop. Oof. So, participants in this research were more than cognizant of this trend to commodify all areas of social reproductive life, and they consistently drew clear attention to the use of human rights to oppose this commodification, which they identified as having worsened over the neoliberal age. These participants consistently argued that a human rights frame was especially useful in challenging this commodification of realms of social reproduction like housing and education, land access and welfare access. And again, this is something that I recognise in my sort of outside academic life. I can't count the number of times I've been at a housing action where the chant, "here to stay, here to fight, housing is a human right," is repeated ad nauseum. It lives in my head. Sometimes I'm just wandering through the house going, "Here to stay, here to fight, housing is a human right. Here to stay, here to fight, housing is a human right." Making a cup of tea going, "Stay, here to fight, housing is a human right. Here to stay." It's fucking absurd. So while the last theme I talked about showed that social movement activists use a human rights frame in an almost pedagogical manner, almost like educating others of the wider impacts of capitalism, this theme reveals that a human rights frame can very specifically reveal a central feature of neoliberal hegemony, which, if disrupted, could significantly destabilise it. And if the counter-hegemonic form of human rights upends the hegemonic one, then that is part of this whole side of consent generating upended. So while it can't be denied that a hegemonic form of human rights definitely exists and is powerful and is bad and sucks, and it's colonial and pushes people into individualistic bourgeois frames. All that stuff. While that is true, I want to stress, I'm not saying that's untrue. I'm saying that is true. The idea that human rights necessarily, like human rights as such, push social movement activism into this bourgeois individualism, an obscure material basis of oppression, doesn't find support in my research. And like the exact opposite. My research provides like empirical support for the work of Paul O'Connell. Radical critiques aren't displaced. People aren't pushed into these bourgeois frames if they know why they're using human rights, if they're careful and specific about their use of human rights. But beyond Paul's work, by challenging commodification of social reproduction, movements which utilise a human rights frame may actually block the privatisation of social reproduction, which is one of the central features of neoliberal hegemony. And in doing so, it may find ways of stalling the systemic reproduction of neoliberalism entirely. That might be very useful for pushing back and actually overturning neoliberalism. And so finally, I think it's worth considering the role of human rights within neoliberal hegemony. For Jessica White, the coercive legal and institutional regime of neoliberalism is justified with reference to the morals of the market, the moral and legal human rights order, which produces a level of consent for, individualized neoliberal subjecthood. And like these neoliberal subjects act as neoliberals, not simply because they're compelled to by market forces, but because they consent to it via internalization of the morals of the market. And in this sense, for Jessica White, the hegemonic expression of human rights isn't hegemonic just because it's dominant in relation to these other expressions, but because it's an integral part of current neoliberal hegemony. And, this could in part explain why, as authors such as Samuel Moyne have shown, the use of human rights language exploded as neoliberalism was established. The consent produced by the legal human rights regime may have been required to establish, part of the essential element of consent to hegemony. And this brings us to the value that challenging hegemonic expressions of human rights has in challenging neoliberal hegemony. God damn, I say hegemony a lot. Fucking hell. Whew. If hegemony is built on both coercion and consent, and the hegemonic expressions of human rights produces the morals of the market as a means through which consent is generated, then challenging hegemonic human rights is an essential challenge to that part of neoliberal hegemony itself. So therefore, in proclaiming an outright opposition to legalistic, individualizing forms of human rights, the participants in my study aren't simply offering an alternative form of human rights that's like endlessly polyvalent, that's one of many, and maybe it's not particularly important just because they use it, but they're offering a counter-hegemonic view of neoliberal subjecthood itself. Moreover, in utilizing human rights as a means of practical movement building, the use of this counter-hegemonic human rights provides not only a challenge to the morals of the market, but also a means of building collective power. And so while critics like White and the people who got weirdly mad about me submitting my PhD might view the perspective illustrated here as part of this endlessly polyvalent social construction of human rights, it is in actuality a really acutely relational form. It's really consistent with a Marxist method. The construction of a counter-hegemonic human rights frame is given specific direction by its relation to neoliberal capitalist hegemony and the hegemonic form of human rights. It's like Snoke says in the best Star Wars movie.
Darkness rises and light to meet it.
And so when Jessica White says that rather than being endlessly polyvalent, alternative constructions of human rights are strongly determined by capitalist hegemony, the argument that I present here is that, yes, that's true. White is correct. The neoliberal morals of the market do in fact structure other expressions of human rights. But counter to White's perspective, that structure is here defined by opposition, not acquiescence. Well, maybe I'm wrong. Alright, thanks for watching. This was obviously quite a dense one today because it was an adaptation of something that was given to an academic audience, so don't worry if it was a bit dense. I'll try and do some future videos where I break stuff down a bit more clearly. But if you enjoyed this, then please subscribe to my Patreon or give off one-off donation to PayPal or Ko-fi. Try and help me survive while I'm on the job hunt again. And yeah, all the best. £10, $10 and up patrons get their names read out in the credits, so I'll do that now for those lovely folk. Demo Squid, Dying of Thirst, Saval Hayes, Bonnie, Katie Marshall, Nina G Public Relations, FD Signifier, Lizzie G, Quint Wolf, Kim Crawley, Anita Innisby, Ellisrin, Sophie, Hey Joe, Cameron Blakemore, Misling, Xander Corvus, Via Westfall, TB Skyen, Christopher Poff, Margussie, Daniel Kusid, Joshua Moldenhauer, Tom Price, Cade Zwari, Esoteric Fictionalism, Shingo, Austin Talman, Polo Lonergan, Robin, Rachel Mixon, Michelle H, Rich, Niels Abelgard, Tinfoil Pancakes, Kieran Gore, Aga Ghost, Barney Carroll, Joel, Daniel Hughes, Nelly Zacheva, J Fraser Cartwright, Aaron, Tamesh Kispeter, and Paul Singleton. If I'm stumbling, it's because I'm so hot that my brain is melting out my ears. So yeah, please sign up if you can. If you can't, share, and I hope you enjoyed. Bye bye. Love you.